Welcome, everybody. My name is Marc Tucker, president of the National Center on Education and the Economy. Some years ago, we started studying the countries with the top performing education systems in the world. A few years after that, after our studies had been maturing for a while, we wrote a document that described in very broad terms the strategies that the top performing countries were using to get their superb results. We called it the 9 building blocks for high performing systems. About 4 years ago, we started commissioning from leading scholars in the world what we hoped would be landmark studies of each of those building blocks, going into far more depth than we had in the past, painting very rich portraits of the policies they were pursuing, the practices that characterized their work, in the hopes that countries around the world could profit from that research. The first of these studies was done over the course of 2 years by Linda Darling-Hammond, then of Stanford University, and her colleagues around the world. The second study that we commissioned was a study very, very important to us, and I believe to many others, of the policies pursued to support families with young children in the top performing countries, and in particular, the policies and practices surrounding the development of early childhood education in those countries. There was hardly any question who we ought to ask to do this. At least from our perspective, the dean of such studies globally is Professor Sharon Lynn Kagan, Virginia and Leonard Marks Professor of Early Childhood and Family Policy and co-director of the National Center for Children and Families at Yale University and, at Teachers College Columbia, and Associate Dean for Policy at that institution, and she is as well Professor Adjunct at Yale University's Child Study Center. Dr. Kagan has studied early childhood policy and advised top government officials on it in places from Mongolia to Shanghai, where I first met her doing that work, to Latin America, countries all over the world, many of them countries developing with many poor children. This study is a study done of the top performing countries where she has been equally at home. Like Dr. Darling-Hammond before her, we asked her to undertake a very large 2-year study going in great depth into these issues. She has done this work in Australia, England, Finland, Hong Kong, the Republic of Korea, and Singapore. She has put together an extraordinary team of first-class scholars who also have been deeply involved in policy making in those countries. They have studied and they have had their hands on. This is the first of 2 reports, each encapsulated in a book published by Teachers College Press. This first one describes the countries. The second, to come out next year, will pull it all together in a cross-case analysis. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and greatly admired colleague, Dr. Sharon Lynn Kagan, to present a summary of her work. When Dr. Kagan has finished doing that, I will ask her a few questions. Dr. Kagan, you're on.
Marc, thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for all of your support of our team's work. Slide 2, please. In addition to welcoming everyone who is on the phone, many of whom I know, I want to say a warm thanks to everybody who works in early childhood in our country and globally and it is our fervent hope that the work that we are going to present will be helpful to you. We are deeply indebted to the National Center for Education and the Economy, and I am also deeply indebted to the co-principal investigators whose picture you see. From the left, Nirmala Rao from Hong Kong. Next to her, now deceased, unfortunately, Colette Taylor from Australia. Christina Kumpalainen from Finland. Gu Young Moon from Korea. Me there in the background. Rebecca Bull from Singapore. And Kathy Silva. These co-principal investigators have been joined by just a fabulous team at Teachers College, and I want to acknowledge them. Eva Landsberg, Jean Reed, Bridget Healy, and Sam Melvin. So this is our collective work, and we're thrilled to be at this point to present it to you. Slide 3, please. Our work began with a profound recognition that our countries are all engaged in tremendous efforts on behalf of young children. And we felt that we needed to reflect on our rooted past as well as to look at contemporary characteristics of a new era, because early childhood today is not where it was even a decade ago. And then finally, we really needed to reconsider and learn as best as we could from what multiple countries are doing. Slide 4, please. So the table of contents of this presentation actually reflects those 3 verbs: reflect, refresh, and reconsider. I'm going to reflect in parts 1 and 2 on contextual frames, and since most of us on this webinar are from the United States, I'm going to use some of our own history and discuss the legacies and challenges associated with that. In parts 3 and 4, I'm going to move to a new era and the way we more globally are thinking about young children. And in the last part, the reconsider part, I'm going to share with you what multiple countries are doing and also what those lessons are for us in the United States. Slide 5, please. So we are going to begin with the contextual frames using the United States as an example. Slide 6, please. For any of us who have looked at the history of this country, we know that our ideological roots are very, very deep. And I would suggest that they are characterized by 3 themes. The first is independence, the second is localism, and the third is entrepreneurialism. Every country has core values. These, I would contend, are ours. Slide 7. So let's look at what these values really mean. Well, if we look at the first value, independence, we know that our country was founded on an effort to escape governmental tyranny, the rules of kings, and that we really wanted to be fiercely independent of them, and we wanted to honor families' independence. We honored the primacy and the privacy of the family, which actually ended up producing an ethos of very limited government, so that for a long time, government intervened only when families failed. If you look at our social history, our very first policy, Social Security in 1935, dealt with orphans and widows. We intervened in times of national crisis, World War I, the Great Depression, the war on poverty. And in many cases, some of those very seminal efforts that were designed actually went away when the crisis ended. So this ethos of independence really says we want families to do it on their own. Next slide, please. Slide 8. The second value is the value of localism. Well, you know, after the Revolutionary War, we were, yes, independent, but we weren't united. And there were big debates about, that's what the Federalist Papers were all about how we would relate, how localities would relate to states, would relate to the federal government. And there was a fierce commitment to tremendous local control. Many felt that communities, as many services as possible, should be kept as close to the locality, and the power should be at the local level so we could hear voices of people and so that tyranny could be avoided. That's the spirit of localism, which frames our work. The next slide, please. Slide 9. The spirit of entrepreneurialism. In this country, there was a tremendous belief, realized and in many cases unrealized, that personal industry and hard work could really lead to an American dream, that people could indeed pull themselves up by the bootstraps and be financially independent. This left us with a residue of pride in entrepreneurialism and a legacy of public and private programs that exist in virtually every field, not just in early childhood. Slide 10, please. So what are the legacies and the challenges that this value base left us? Slide 11, please. I would suggest that if we took stock, these legacies would affect early childhood quality, the equity of the services, and the efficiency and sustainability of what America is and is not providing young children. Slide 12, please. If we look at the first of those, quality, the red arrow indicates where the United States is. And you can see, of these countries listed, we are about midway. Of the countries that were studied, 4 of the 6 were above us. Australia was very, very close to us, just a little bit below. And Singapore was just a touch farther down, but rapidly moving. The point of this slide is that in quality, we surely don't do as well as we could. Slide 13, please. If we look at equity, we're actually doing even worse. That all of the countries, 5 of the 6, with Australia right behind us, are actually doing a better job on the equity of services that are provided for preschoolers around the world. Not a good story. And if we look at slide 14, please, we can see that we fall very far short, considerably far short of the Nordic countries in our investments as a percentage of our GDP on pre-primary education. To sum up in slide 15, we probably would all agree that in the United States, quality is not where it should be, that we're not achieving the kinds of positive gains that we wish we could for children, that our work is severely compromised by a workforce that is beset with challenges, that from an equity perspective, we have a great deal of difficulty in establishing equitably distributed and totally inclusive programs, with often low-income and rural children having less access. And if we address the efficiency and sustainability of programs, we know that we are politically vulnerable. They are politically vulnerable here today, gone tomorrow. We know they're uncoordinated. We know that in many cases they are market-driven with limited regulatory constraints. And we really know that try as we have, the smart thinking that we possess in our field has not always made its way into policy or into meaningful change. Slide 16, please. So if that's sort of the legacy of the past, what does this new era, what does today bring us? Slide 17. I would suggest that if I were a time traveler looking backward on what was happening in the United States, I would say that we have made some progress, but indeed that it is a very new era for young children. Slide 18, please. Without belaboring it, we know that there is a lot of new research science that is guiding many of our efforts and much of our policy. We have the undisputable evidence from the neurosciences, from the evaluation sciences, and from the econometric sciences. We also know that these in the lab trends are now being matched by a lot of new research on systems theory and on implementation sciences. So there's a new scientific terra firma on which to build early childhood programs. Slide 19, please. This is manifesting itself in trends on the ground that we have, in general, growing understanding of the importance of early childhood, plentiful efforts. We have got a lot of viable practice models, and overall, over the past years, we have got considerably increased investments. Slide 20, please. Around the globe trends, we know that the young children who are in our care, whose parents have trusted them to us, are living in a world where globalization and technology will be the norm, where environmental concerns are raging, and where the gender roles that have been encased for decades in many places are changing. We also know that there are tremendous economic and social changes. So all in all, slide 21, there are a lot of new ways of thinking about children. And slide 22, our team contends that these in the lab trends, these on the ground trends, these around the globe trends really means that we need a new think in that bubble think about children and about policy. Slide 23, please. The new think about children. I would suggest that we are thinking that children are competent learners, more competent than we've ever really ascribed them in the past, although we always knew children learned all the time. That we know children are equal rights bearers, and that we are understanding the importance of the social context for young children. Let me elaborate by looking at slide 24, please. When we say that today's children are competent learners, we just don't mean numbers and letters and literacy and numeracy, but we mean they're learning every minute of their lives. They're learning we're learning and they are learning about their physical competencies, their emotional competencies, the way they are, harmony, and I call your attention to the icon at the bottom right, that kids really are competent. Slide 25 tells us that around the world, people are recognizing that children are rights bearers. The new Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 that are listed on the right, for the first time are prioritizing in goal number 4, young children and services for them. But we also know that children have entitlements to safety, to protection, education, health and nutrition, to equality, and to a really good environment. So we are understanding children as rights bearers as we never have before. And in slide 26, we now all acknowledge that children are dramatically influenced by their peers, by their families, by their neighborhoods, by their communities, and yes, indeed, profoundly by their governments. Slide 27, please. Well, if you accept those characteristics about children, each of those three has a parallel policy commitment. If you think that all children are competent learners, then they deserve high-quality environments. If you think they're equal rights bearers, then adults have got the obligation to distribute resources equitably. And if you think that all children live in complex contexts, then it's our job to make sure that the services that we provide attend to those diverse contexts efficiently and in a way that is very sustained. Slide 28, please. I'm going to focus for a minute about new ways of thinking about policy because this was the groundwork that led to the framework of our study. Slide 29 suggests that we are going to take a systems approach to address all three of those commitments to children and the quality of their environments, to distributing services equity, providing a range of services, and to creating efficient, organized, and sustained systems by focusing on systems policy. In slide 30, we return to the first. What is really a quality or an optimum learning environment? Slide 31 gives us the answer to that, which many of us have been working on for most of our lives. It is composed of a system that has standards, that bases curriculum assessments on those standards, that has supportive child-centered pedagogy, that takes into consideration all aspects of learning, and that provides for continuity, P-3, across the grades. Slide 32. Well, if those are the characteristics of a learning system, what are the characteristics of the services that should be manifest? And I would ask you to turn to slide 33 to say that it's not only pre-K programs, but it's health programs, it's child care, it's transition programs, it's parental leave, it's services for children with handicapping conditions. So an array of services need to be considered. And in slide 35, we begin to look at what do we really mean by an early childhood system, and that is elaborated in some of my former work as consisting of the programs represented by those flowers, those different kinds of programs, and the infrastructure or the soil in which we make those programs strong. Slide 37 says that those gears or the ingredients in the soil have a variety of components. In slide 38, we begin to say that we need engagement with family, community, and citizens as the base for an early childhood system. We need data-driven improvement, and we need transparency that is achieved via data. In slide 39, we look at years 3 and 4, that we maintain sustainability and equity by having diverse financing mechanisms. We maintain that by having a focus on governance, and by that I mean we consider which ministries have the lead responsibility for young children and which areas, is it local, regional, or national. Other gears that we need to attend to are quality via program regulation and inspection, the capacity of our system to do what it says it's going to do and what we want it to do via professional development, and we look at alignment via transition and linkages. All that stated up in slide 41 means that there are two formulas, slide 41, means that there are really two formulas, that a system is made up of the services or the programs plus the infrastructure. And unless you have both, you can't have a system. It also means 8 minus 1 equals 0. If you take away any single element of that infrastructure or those services, you indeed don't have a system. So in slide 42, we recognize that we have changing ideas about children, that we're not thinking about them as little adults, as miniatures, as we did in the Victorian era, but we're thinking about them as competent learners, as living in complex environments. And in slide 34, we are also thinking about our policies differently. We're thinking about not focusing only on individual programs, but about thinking about and learning about early childhood. So we are at a new era in how we think about children, how we think about systems. And it is these thoughts, slide 44 please, that have created the reconsiderations that framed this study as we began to look at efforts from multiple countries. In turning to the Early Advantage suite of studies, In slide 45, we note that we had 4 major goals. The first was to learn from the very best countries in the planet. The second was to use state-of-the-art knowledge and a workable theory of change. The third was really to create a rigorous quality international study, one where we did a great deal of validation. And the fourth was to produce very useful products for diverse audiences. Let me unpack each of those, beginning with slide 46, learning from the best countries. The countries we chose are those that are highlighted in yellow on your screen, but it wasn't without a lot of methodology and debate. We used 2 primary criteria. We used the results from the PISA studies in math and science. These were predicated on data from 2012, which we began the study, or we did the framing for it in 2014. Those are the most recent data that were available at the time. And you can see, if you look vertically, which countries fell into the top third of the PISA countries, which into the next third, and which that were a bit lower. The second criteria we used was the Economist Intelligence Unit Report. That was published by the Lean Foundation. It was called Starting Well. Many of you I know are familiar with it. It ranked 45 countries in the world about how they were doing in early childhood in particular. And for this, I would ask you to look at the horizontally, look at this grid horizontally, and you can see those that the Economist rated as high: Netherlands, South Korea, Finland, Belgium, Denmark, New Zealand, Norway, the UK, and France. Medium in the next tier. And finally, the lowest tier, which would be the lowest 15 of 45, not the lowest in the world, but the lowest 15 of those 45. We decided that we wanted a strong representation from the high PISA countries when we cross-mapped this. So South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, interestingly, Asian countries. We also wanted a very high representation from the economist countries, South Korea, Finland, and the United Kingdom. And for a variety of reasons that will become apparent in a few moments, we added Australia because Australia resembles the United States in its decentralized government structure, much like us, and also because it was managing to do some very, very innovative work in early childhood. So those are our 6 countries. Slide 47, please. As I promised, we invoked systems thinking, the formula that I just told you, programs plus infrastructure equals a system. And we also invoked a very rigorous theory of change. And I want to especially acknowledge Marc and Betsy Barmusi of the National Center for Education and the Economy, because they pressed us hard to generate a theory of change and to generate working hypotheses which guided our work. Let me first turn to systems thinking in 48. As you can see, we built upon the flowers and the gears by inserting the oval in the middle, the green oval that asks for a high-quality learning environment. In slide 49, we developed our theory of change. And important for this discussion, I'd like to call your attention to the 2 outer frames, the ones in the green and the turquoise, labeled G and H, that are labeled temporal and sociocultural. These are the contexts, 2 different kinds of contexts that we believe frame everything that governments do and actually that happens to young children. I'll say more about that in a moment, but you can see that the A box, the blue box at the top, has the programs and the services. The B box has the infrastructure that we've just talked about. It leads to an effective early childhood system, but that will not alone produce child and family well-being. We must be cognizant of systemic goals in box D, what I've been talking to you about, quality, equity, and efficiency and sustainability, which unfortunately in the United States we're not doing a great job on. But that alone even won't do it. We must make sure that our families are meaningfully engaged and are organizationally supported. So it is only when these things are in place that we believe we will be able to have the kind of child and family well-being that we all desire. If we could go to slide 50, I'd like to talk about a rigorous quality study. We began with very, very clear research questions, the way you would if you were doing any kind of a rigorous scientific study. We were interested in why the policies came into place, what they are, what makes a system effective, how are they similar and different, why do these countries vary in their commitments to early childhood. We did a thorough document review. There were only 16 studies in the world done before this one on early childhood systems. Many of them only looked at one or two countries. None of them employed the rigorous methodology that we employ. None of them conducted on-site interviews. But we did review those, and from them, we refined our research questions and our study methodology. In the turquoise box, you can see that we really did employ solid data and analysis. We used common protocols developed by the principal investigators, hotly debated protocols. We interviewed in all of the 6 countries common informants. We used a validated analysis process that sequentially and periodically we engaged people who were not involved in the study to review every element of our study, from the research questions to the first drafts of the case studies, to make sure, indeed, that our data were accurate. So we feel we've got a rigorous quality study. In slide 51, our commitment to produce useful products for diverse audiences has been manifest by giving you a preview. This is volume 1, the narrative stories of 6 very high-performing countries, where we talk about their practice and their policy implications and how they emanated from their diverse contexts. In volume 2, we are going to talk about the building blocks for effective systems, and we are also going to be developing a host of policy materials that are policy briefs that are countries at a glance and NCEE, as well as we will have our websites up very shortly. So what did we really learn in slide 52 from all of these countries, and what does it really mean for the United States? Slide 51. Probably the most important lesson is something that we all know or have known, but I can say that this work validates it without question, and that is that our inherent contexts matter, those that are very, very deep. And in this study of the 6 countries, we found that they fell roughly into 3 categories, that there was a Nordic approach, that there was an Asian approach, and that there was an Anglo approach. Now, let me say, I'm not suggesting that all of the Nordic countries are exactly like Finland, or all the Asian countries are like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Korea, the Republic of Korea. But there are some characteristics that do transcend. Basically, in the Nordic countries, we find a very heavy public commitment to not only funding programs, but to providing them. We see far less focus on monitoring and oversight, and we see services that are run by trust, where children are far more heavily engaged in making decisions about the nature of their services. In the Asian countries, in contrast, we actually see a very heavy privatization of services. We see that government funds are used to support the infrastructure, think the flowers and the gears, that in the Asian countries, those flowers are very heavily privatized, but the gears are very heavily publicly subsidized. We see that there is much more heavy program monitoring. We see inventive incentivizations for quality, how we move to quality, and we see countries that are very, very willing to policy borrow and to innovate and are not really afraid of social change. In the Anglo approach, in this study, characteristic of England and of Australia, we see mixed sector provision. We see a lot of public and a lot of private provision. We also see countries that have fluctuating economic conditions where their early childhood policies are often quite responsive to those fluctuating conditions. We see a heavy focus on quality enhancement, and we see a very strong commitment to data and to monitoring. So these contexts vary, and they vary significantly, and they influence what countries are doing for young children. If you move with me to slide 54, oopsie, there's a typo in that slide, sorry about that. We see that these historic sociocultural contexts have incredible influence. That in Finland, where there's trust in government and trust in teachers, there's limited monitoring and accountability. Where there is universalism and a community ethos, we see a wide array of public services. In Hong Kong, we see a hybrid of Chinese and British influences and values. And there we see a Western child-centered pedagogy, but one that is infused with very high academic expectations for children. In Singapore, a comparatively new country, we see an incredible spirit of innovation and a willingness to policy borrow and to rapidly expand programs and services. And in Australia, we see an incredible commitment to diversity, largely rooted in its history and commitment to Indigenous and immigrant populations. We see a ferocious commitment, not always realized, to egalitarianism and social justice. But if you take a look at their policy frameworks, they look quite different from those of other countries. So these historic values really do influence the way countries carry out their early childhood policies. But if you move with me to slide 55, you will see that it's not just those historic sociocultural values, that there are contemporary issues that all countries are facing that dramatically influence. So, for example, in Korea and Singapore, much of their commitment to young children is designed to counteract their falling birth rates. That they really have pro-natalist policies because they want to incentivize birth rates. Indeed, in Australia, England, and Hong Kong, there are tremendous social inequities, and many of the policies are designed to redress these. If you take a look at the nature of funding in a country like Finland that has benefits from oil and from technology, there was an economic base that enabled them to provide heavy public funding in addition to a predisposed ideology to it. But it's very interesting as the funding situation in Finland is changing, as they are facing new challenges economically, they have altered their policies. So the benefits for children are not as generous as they used to be. If we take a look at early childhood pedagogy, we see that there's a tremendous emphasis on multiculturalism that is manifest in part in response to rising immigrant rates. And we notice, if you look at the materials from England and Finland, where this is pronounced and is more recent. Indeed, we see differences, the way the pedagogy plays itself out in the Asian countries, depending upon market forces and market needs. So all of this is to say, and I would turn back to the two frames for our theory of change, that indeed that proved to be true, that there is a durable sociocultural context and also a more changeable but nonetheless equally penetrating sociocultural context. Slide 56. Well, if the first lesson was that context matters, the second lesson is that diverse and plentiful services matter. In each of these countries, there are an array of rich services that are available for children that we don't see in this country. In the pre- and perinatal period, all of them have really robust family leave, and many of them had very special provisions for fathers. All of them have some form of secured health beginning at the onset of pregnancy. And all of them had some type of universal home visiting service. Think about our own country. For infants and toddlers, most of them had subsidies for low-income and at-risk families. A few of them had very robust services, notably Korea, for very young children from age birth to 2. Many of them had some form of ongoing support for parenting. It didn't just stop 6 weeks after the baby was born. And most of them had some form of transition support that would ease children and families from home into their school settings. For preschoolers, all of them had service in the year that preceded formal entry into schooling. Many of them are universal, and we can learn a lot from the reception classes in England and from what Australia and Finland are doing. Most have supports for those who are working with young children. With regard to transitions, they take this issue of transition much more seriously than we do in our country, unfortunately. All had some dedicated form of effort to support transitions, and often this was left to the local level so that localities etch their own, but increasingly there is national government interest in what is going on with regard to transition. So this notion of dispersed and plentiful services really matters, and it stood out dramatically as we looked at these countries. The third lesson, embracing slide 57, is that these countries scattered around the world all do early childhood with quality, but they all do it very, very differently. There is not one model. There is not one right approach. The approaches are very much contoured by the context. So let me take a minute and just walk you through some of these countries in terms of who they are, what they are, and what I think they can contribute to the United States, to our thinking. Colette Taylor was the principal investigator from the University of Melbourne for Australia, and we know that Australia is a very diverse nation. It is very large. It has a federal system that places a lot of responsibilities on their states and territories, and it has a government that is increasingly interested in early childhood education and care at all levels. From Australia, we saw that indeed it is possible, even in a decentralized country, to establish a national reform agenda and a national quality framework. Their framework was established nationally, but it was adopted by the states and territories. And we also understand that it takes a great deal of commitment to implementing the framework, and we have a great deal to learn from Australia in terms of how they go about not just creating it, but implementing it. If we turn to England in slide 59, where Kathy Silva was the principal investigator from the University of Oxford, we see a mixed public-private system, a lot kind of like our own. However, they do provide near universal provision for all children ages 3 to 6. And increasingly, they are targeting children younger than age 3, universally, all children who are 2 years old who are at risk. The findings from England that we can learn from is they really do place a strong emphasis on parents and on community engagement. They have a first-rate inspection system. They are not afraid of regulation or afraid of monitoring. They understand that monitoring makes a difference to quality, and the results from their monitoring efforts, by the way, they drop in their monitors unannounced at any time. The results from those monitorings are made available to parents, to policymakers, and to the public. They rigorously analyze their data, and they use it as tools for pedagogical and program improvement. Now, I'm not suggesting that we want automatic drop-in of regulation, but what this study does suggest to us is that countries do place a premium on monitoring and regulation, and they're not gun-shy of doing it, and they know how to use the data that they have collected. Lessons to be learned from England. On slide 60, we turn to Finland, where Christina Kumpulainen from the University of Helsinki was the principal investigator. And we learn a lot from Finland. We know that they are consistently the highest achieving European nation on PISA, and that they regard equity and quality in NCEE as a cultural imperative. And I don't say those words lightly. They really, really do. We can see their world-class commitment to welfare and education, one that probably is nowhere near paralleled in the United States. We also see that ideology transcends what they require. We see that they provide robust opportunities for professional development, that they have a workforce that has BAs, but I want to caution us to understand that their BA is a 3-year BA. It is not the same as our BA, and that the requirements for early childhood teachers at the BA level are very different from primary, reception classes in primary, where the master's is required. So they do have that gap, but we can learn a lot from the way they have structured their system. In slide 61, we can learn from Hong Kong. Nirmala Rao from the University of Hong Kong, was the principal investigator there. And we see that there is a very high achieving society that has focused since the 1990s, on high quality early childhood. So they have less of a history of focusing on this, but indeed they have made a lot of progress. They have a mixed market delivery system. Services are all provided in the private sector, and I want to underscore that, but they control the private sector. They're not afraid to regulate it, and they're not afraid to incentivize quality. They have a good governance system. They have an educated and an entrepreneurial population, so indeed this makes sense. It's important to note that originally in Hong Kong, they provided demand-side funding, and because of the concerns about quality in the last few years, they have converted to supply-side funding, where they control and distribute resources to those centers who are of high quality, whether they are in the public or the private sector. So there are ways to capitalize on the markets that we can learn from them. From the Republic of Korea, where Mu Young-moon from the Korea Institute of Child Care and Education, thank you, slide 62, was the principal investigator. We need to understand that that is a country overcame incredibly inauspicious beginnings, and it has progressed to produce one of the world's most educated and skilled workforces. It predicated its work on a commitment from the very beginning to young children. It is important to note that in that country, education spending is half of the United States as a proportion of GDP, and that its enrollment rates exceed 95%. So there are things to learn about efficiency from the Republic of Korea. It's important to note that it does not centralize its governance structure. It has two ministries that are equally engaged in the provision of services, but that it has created functional integration by establishing a curriculum that holds across all services in the country, and that curriculum also provides incentivization. It is important to understand that in Korea there is a robust commitment to research. They fund government-funded institutes. They pilot things, they learn from those pilots, and they apply them to the population at large. It is also important to note that they have a unique commitment to universal services for children under the age of 2. In slide 63, we turn to Singapore, where Rebecca Bull from the National Institute of Education was the PI, and there too, like Korea, we've got a society that is emerging. It's a fairly recently emerging society, although it has a very, very diverse landscape. It has expanded using the private sector because it would not have been able to do it all within the public sector. It is characterized by a spirit of innovation and experimentation. It too has a centralized curriculum, but unlike Korea, to maximize efficiencies, it has created a centralized agency where it moved programs from many ministries into the ECTA, the Early Childhood Development Agency, and has consolidated its approach to governance, and as a result provides some of the most innovative professional development opportunities that we indeed see in the world. They also provide incredible commitments that focus on children's transition. In slide 64, I wanted to just summarize, as I'm coming to the penultimate slide here, that we're here. We're at book 1. We're telling the story of individual jurisdictions. We're in book 1 examining the rationales and the context. We're analyzing the approaches and the policies. I would say that this book focuses on why things exist and what exists. In book 2 that's coming, and we hope you will all be tuned in for that, we are going to reveal in far greater depth the strategic constructs that transcend the individual jurisdictions. We're going to reveal what we think are the essential pillars and the building blocks of what it takes to create these systems, with examples, some replicable in the United States. I would say that if the book 1 focuses on what exists now, book 2 really aims to catalyze action for the future, and it will focus on how things could and might be done. Finally, I'd like to end in slide 65 with what I think is the bottom line, and that is that we will never be able to act differently unless we think differently, unless we get into the interiors of our context and really explore what it is that is unique to America and what we can adapt from other countries. My favorite quote is what Steve Jobs said to John Scully: do you all want to spend the rest of your life selling water, or do you want a chance to change the world? They did. They revolutionized 6 industries, important ones, but I believe that you and I, all of us who are on this line, are really about changing the world. And I think Isaacson said it best in the opening to his book on Steve Jobs: we may be crazy, but it is only the people who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who do. And it is in that spirit of collective sharing, collective learning, collective doing that I am really thrilled to share the data that my beloved colleagues and I have worked on for 2 years, with the hopes that it can inform what we in America do for young children, notably for all, but for our disadvantaged children as well. So I think I talked indeed long enough, let me end there and say thank you for being patient and listening. There's a lot of data.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much. I think you can see, all of you who have participated in this webinar, that Lynn and her colleagues have done something that has really never been done before. And it put together a picture of a rapidly changing kaleidoscopic field, which in its essence is just beginning to gel. When Lynn took this study on, she did it with enormous enthusiasm. But my expectation was that what she would do was draw on a lifetime of experience and leadership in this field by summarizing what she knew. It was not very far into the study when she called me and Betsy Brown-Ruzi with an enormous sense of excitement, because she was learning at such a great rate things she did not know, and that was exciting to us. I think it's fair to say, more than anything else, what Lynn and her colleagues saw was that the kaleidoscope had not yet gelled, that the big issue everywhere, from Asia to Europe and beyond, and certainly in the United States, was how to take a multitude of beginnings, from neuroscience to economics, from curriculum to governmental structure, and construct effective systems. You will get a lot of hints in this book about where that has taken them, and I very much hope that you will come to our NCEE website, both to find out where you can get this book, it will lead you there, but to look at a number of other resources that will be on the website that are drawn from this first book. I also invite you back in the months to come to another webinar where we will talk about the second book, and that is the book that will concentrate, as Lynn just said, on effective systems. What does a country or a state here in the United States have to do to pull all of these great beginnings together in a way that produces a highly effective system with equity and efficiency? That's the question we will address when we reconvene. You will find that the hashtag #EarlyAdvantage will enable you to continue this conversation online. We look forward to seeing you again. Take care, everybody, and thanks for coming.